We're on a farm here to illustrate with Dave Seibert. Can we start over?
Okay, here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2.
We're at a cattle farm here that we're going to try to illustrate the practices that we talked about this morning with Dave Seibert, who will explain this forage cutter and how it works. So, Dave.
In beef cattle production, of course, there's really two different seasons that's probably the most important on feeding the beef cattle herd. And of course, during the winter season, most of the time we supply cows with a harvested feed product. And probably the one that's used the most in Illinois and used for many years has been hay as being that source of winter feed. Hay can of course be harvested all the way from just loose hay. If we go back many years ago, whenever they just harvested and put up loose hay, then of course we came in with small balers and then of course big round balers, and then of course now we're using quite a few big square balers. And of course in that hay field, which is usually cut maybe 3, possibly up to 4 times a year, the first thing you got to do is use some type of mower to mow that hay. And this particular mower here, it's actually a pretty good size mower. On the front here has a disc blade that cuts it. You can either have a disc type blade or a sickle type blade mowing the hay. This is actually not only a mower, but it is also a hay processor in which that hay of course flows through. It has rollers back here that actually would roll that hay, and that kind of conditions the hay. The reason for that is it really makes the hay dry out a lot faster, and then these wings on the back of it can either allow the hay to be dispersed just the way it's cut, or even move together into a windrow. So it can mow a lot of hay. It's a big mower, and of course also process that hay.
Very good. Can we go ahead and proceed to the rake? That's the next process, I think, in the hay making. Okay, we're standing in front of a hay rake, and Dave, you want to kind of tell us how it works?
Yeah, of course that mower back there, and it looked like it might have been a 12-foot mower or something of that size. Quite often with the baling of the hay, they want to bale more than that. So this is really kind of an open wing rake here where you can pull maybe 2 of those rows together, and again what it does is brings the hay and puts it in what we call a windrow, and then of course with that they can come in and bale the hay. The thing about this particular type rake here, and the important thing is to handle the hay gently. Again, this is getting pretty close to being dry, ready for bales. And in the hay that you're making, especially the legume part of that hay, the leaves are what really is a nutritious part. And if you have a rake that just beats the thunder out of it, you knock a lot of those leaves off. So you want to handle that hay real gently. You want to get it into a row so that baler can come in and of course harvest that, bale it, and get it ready for storage.
Okay, Dave, what do you call this piece of machinery?
Well, this would be a bale hauler or bale accumulator, and this particular operation uses big round bales. And of course, when they're baling the hay, the bales, once it's fully made, it's just dropped out in the field. So what you have to do is move that bale off the field so you don't have a dead spot where it is, and of course take it to storage. So what this does, actually, as you drive down, this arm here would actually pick up this round bale and put it, over onto the hauler. There's actually can be 2 sets of bales here. You can have a row over on this side over here, as well as a row back here. So what this does is puts probably 6 bales on here and hauls 6 bales at once, as compared to just putting one on the back of the tractor and taking it to storage. So it transports the big round bales from the hay field to the storage, to the location where it's stored.
Okay, now let us take a look at the baler itself.
Okay, yes.
Okay, Dave, this is what we call a round baler, is that right?
That's correct. Last time we just saw the hauler. Of course, once we break the hay, this would actually be what puts it in the big round bales. The pickups are down here. Actually, there's belts on the inside that will start that bale in a small, circle, and just cylinder. And of course, it'll just keep expanding that cylinder until it gets, and I suspect this is probably a 5.5 or 6 foot a round baler, they call it. Once it, of course, gets that, and there's some compaction occurring there. The nice part about round bales is it tends to help shed the rain. When you think of the old haystack as being something that the water would run off of, a similar type thing happens here with round bales, especially if it has some grass in it. Now, once that bale is, of course, fully developed, then they can do different things. One is they can put string around that bale, and it's usually about 10 or 12 wraps of string around the bale. The other thing is what this particular baler uses here is a net wrap, and we'll see bales here before long that actually have the net wrap on it. Again, it holds that bale compact, and really it reduces the amount of spoilage that can occur as compared to a bale that's not wrapped. One thing important about a bale is try to protect it not only from rain on the top, and that kind of helps do this somewhat, but also moisture on the bottom, and we'll see that in a while. So mostly round bales are made here, or that's what their source of roughage is round bales, and of course all this would be for winter feeding of beef cattle.
And what's the piece of equipment right behind it?
That is actually a hay processor. And this is where you take the bale, and you can see up here actually where they pull the net wrapping off, because you don't want that plastic to be ingested by the cow, because you can create some problems with the digestive tract. But what they can do is in here is put the one bale here, another bale they can carry out there. This does have a chopper or kind of a flailer on the side here. And then, of course, that hay is conveyed out and hits this and really lays the hay in a row. So this is what we call a hay processor that processes that hay, lays it out in a row for the cows to consume. There's different ways we can feed hay. One, and what a lot of people do, is use round bale feeders. And actually, they take the bale out, they would put a ring around it, and of course limit the access to the hay. Another way, of course, is the hay processor. A third way is actually what we call a hay well, it's also a hay processor, but it's a grinder in which you would drop 1 or 2 bales in. It would have scales on it, so you know how much feed you put in there. It would tend to grind that up. You could also put other types of feed with it, meaning sources of protein supplement, some other feeds that you would balance a ration with. So that is, like I mentioned, 3 different ways of actually feeding hay. One is a round bale feeder. Second one would be a processor. The third was actually where you take the hay, grind it up, mix it with other ingredients to have a complete diet then.
Now, behind you is a feeder, is that right?
Yeah, this is actually a feed hauling and conveying system. With the long auger on here, it'd probably be best to take the feed and convey it into some type of stationary feeder. We had out here some creep feeders, and this would work quite good for that. You would mix in your diet into it, and you would haul it out to, let's say, the pasture or wherever that is, maybe a feedlot, and put it in a bin, and then, of course, convey the feed out of the bin, or either it'd be a self-feeder that you'd feed, or convey it out of the feeder to feed. So this is really a kind of a transport system to move the feed to another storage area.
Now that's basically for the calves, right?
That's right, yes. Like the creep feed, this would be for the calves, or it would be if you had some cattle in a feedlot where you would have self-feeders there. Maybe you have a storage bin in close to a feedlot in which you want to store some feed there, kind of hand feed them. So this is a transport feed to a storage location or to a self-feeder.
And we have another feed wagon here.
Yes, this is actually this is a mixture. You couldn't put big round bales in this particular one. It has to be feed that's already processed. And if you had, let's say, out in a pasture or even a feedlot situation where you had a trough, and you could, of course, mix feed in this, and then, of course, go out and just, on the other side is actually the conveyor that conveys it out, and you could drop it into a trough area. So it's the feed cattle in a pasture situation, maybe, you know, most likely along a trough. And that point that is put there, that would be the conveyor. That's where it has an auger in the bottom that conveys the feed forward. Those augers there actually would carry the feed out and dump it into a feed trough.
And keeping in mind that this is only a cow-calf operation, so we wouldn't be feeding calves any larger than probably 500-600 pounds?
Yeah, they would have heifer development that they would use this for as well. They have fed some cattle, not a large percentage of them. Most of the cattle go to a feedlot, but for their heifer development, if they want to supplement those calves that's, let's say, strictly on hay or maybe on pasture and it gets dry, they would use this feeder here to go out and supplement additional feed to them. Feeding, as we mentioned, just kind of sounds like just taking some feed and dumping it out for the cattle. Well, it's much more important to not just take feed out there, to make sure you got the right balance of feed of different ingredients. This here is actually an electronic scale. This whole mixing thing is setting on a scale. So when you put in, and you may have to, for that ration, put in, you know, an energy source like maybe soy hulls. You might have to put in some protein supplement. You might have to also put in minerals and vitamins. And of course, you know by your ration, and you hopefully have a ration balancing program. It would be a computer program that requires X number of pounds of this ingredient and you know, X number of pounds for 2 or 3 other ingredients. And of course, with this electronic scale, it'll tell you exactly how many pounds you have of each of the ingredients as you add them in. And of course, it allows you to come up with the proper mix of ingredients that meets the nutritional requirement of the animals that you're feeding. And of course, there's a lot of difference in what the nutritional requirements are for, let's say, a bunch of calves that maybe are creeped as compared to heifers that's being developed, as compared to steers that's being finished, or even brood cows that may need some winter supplement. So again, the scale is real important, and it ties to a ration balancing program.
Dave, we're looking at a new source of feed supply for cattle here. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, we're real fortunate here in the Midwest because of the expansion of ethanol plants. And you know, many people think that once they use corn, the only product they end up with is ethanol. But fortunate for livestock producers, about half or a third to half of that product ends up as what we call distillers grain. And that's what I have in my hand here. It's just a great source of protein supplement for cattle. A lot of it's used in the feedlot, some in the dairy industry, but especially when we think about cow-calf industry, we can use this to supplement lower quality forages. And I think I mentioned this morning what's going to change in the livestock industry. Well, one thing I think is going to change is we're going to use a lot more what I call crop residues, whether that might be straw that we use, whether it might be corn stalks. And one piece of equipment that this particular operation plans to buy is this bale processor where you can dump 2 big round bales of corn stalks, straw, even lower quality hay, and of course with that mix this this distiller's grain. Now, what is the value of distiller's grain? Well, it's a couple things. One, it's a super protein source. It runs about 28 to 30% protein, which is very high. Second of all, it's a good mineral source. It has a very high level of phosphorus in it. And the third thing, it has a fairly high level of fat. It runs about 8 to 10% fat. So here we have protein, here we have fat for energy, and here we have mineral, meaning phosphorus, which is one of our most expensive minerals to purchase and to use to supplement our cows. Now, the other thing, of course, when we use this, calcium is fairly low, so we have to make sure that we're supplementing calcium and some of the vitamins and minerals that we need as well. But what they have here is a source to supplement the brown bales, which you'll see next, and to really provide a balanced ration for this cow herd, either during gestation or during lactation. The product they got here, they got fairly reasonable with trucking and everything, and that's a nice part about being in Illinois. We have plants throughout the state. I believe now we have 11 or 12 plants with a few more planned to being built. We're actually about number 2 or number 3 in ethanol production in the United States, and of course that means that we're going to end up with a lot of this great feed for beef cattle.
Now this product comes either dry or wet. I assume this is wet?
That's right. Really, I encourage operations, if they're going to use it, is to use it in what we call the wet product. Now, really, the wet product can have some range of moisture. There's some plants, and it can be up to 70% moisture, 30% dry matter. This particular plant they're getting out of usually is about 50-50, 50% moisture, 50% dry matter. Of course, being that dry, they can pack it, as you notice here. And as far as storing it, that's critical to get it packed, to get the oxygen out of it. Also, too, when you think about a drier product like that, meaning 50% moisture, 50% dry matter, you don't have as much in trucking when you tend to move it as compared to a higher moisture product. And of course, the other thing, too, is the plant does not have to dry the product. There's a lot of this that's moved by rail. It's even moved by barges, by containers. It's sent all over the world. And of course, the competitive advantage we have here is the company does not have, or the plant does not have to dry this product. So that requires a fair amount of energy to dry it. And of course, we can buy the product a lot cheaper. The other thing is the product that's wet like this, meaning 50% moisture, 50% dry matter, is actually a superior product as compared to the dry product. So a lot of this is being fed. I think this is what's going to help keep livestock industry in the Midwest and in Illinois.
What about the keeping qualities of it?
Yeah, and that's of course, whenever you buy it wet, you know, you have to figure out how you're going to store it and how you're going to, so you don't lose it. And there's probably number one thing is, if you're going to store it, you don't want a really wet product, meaning that 70% moisture product. What happens? You just can't pack it. You can't get on top of it. So with the 50% dry matter, you notice how they drove up and down here that allowed them to pack it. The number one thing about storage is get the oxygen out of it. And, you know, kind of like a regular silo that you put silage in, packing is extremely important. After you once get the oxygen out of it by packing it, then you probably need to think about some means of covering it. And covering it can be a combination. What they might use is, first of all, they might treat it. One thing, they can treat it with salt is an option. You could also treat it with limestone, meaning put limestone on top of it. The third thing is actually using propionic acid and spraying that on it, and that's what they're doing with this particular location here. Probably even with doing that, you'll still want to cover it with plastic in order to keep the water from leaching whatever you spray on top of it through it. With limestone, you may not have to cover it as much as, let's say, the other two, the salt and just strictly putting propionic acid. The nice part about the limestone is it's a source of calcium, so it can really be mixed in with the feed, and of course it really helps supplement the calcium part of the finished diet.
Dave, tell us a little bit how the availability of this and just how a producer can get a hold of this and product.
Yeah, actually, I did something this past year. I put together a list of all the plants in Illinois and within 50 miles of Illinois, and I think I came up with 34 plants. Now, these plants was not only distillers like we have here, which is an ethanol production, it was also, and those are dry miller plants, we call them. And that's all the new plants. Another thing is our wet miller plants, and they make our corn sweeteners. And there's one of those in Pekin, and there's different ones, one in Decatur. And out of those comes your gluten. And then a third product would be your soybean hulls. And there's plants just all over Illinois, many of them in the central part of the state, that produce soybean hulls. As far as acquiring this then, The bigger plants, they have their own marketing people. And you just call them up and tell them how much you want and determine a price. Sometimes they will post the plant on their website. I mean, post the price on their website. Other times you have to call them to get the price. Other ones that may go, actually if they're not a real big plant and they may only have a single plant, they will go through a commodity broker that may handle product from 6 or 8 different plants. And this price fluctuates. It would be the most reasonable during the summer, and it'd be the most expensive during the middle of the winter. And the reason for that is the number of animals that are being fed. In the, you know, as we move into the fall, calves are weaned, feedlots tend to fill up with a lot of cattle, and of course then you have to feed a lot of harvested feed, and the price of this can go up really high. As compared to this time of the year, or even earlier than this, feedlots are not full, a lot of animals out in pasture, so the price isn't near as high. So the ideal thing to do is to purchase this stuff sometime during the summer or the late summer, early fall. Store it because you can buy it fairly reasonable. Then of course what you have to do is make sure you store it where you don't lose a lot of it, and that can be to the people's advantage. So really we're blessed here in Illinois with a lot of product and access to that product. So I think we're very fortunate to have this type of product.
Dave, there seemed to be some confusion between this product and gluten. Can you kind of clear the water there?
Yeah, there's 2 different types of processes. One, and the one that's been around for a long time, is what we call wet milling. And wet milling is really to produce the corn sweeteners. And there's a plant in Decatur that's a wet miller plant. There's one in Pekin that's a wet miller plant. And out of those comes a product we call gluten. And gluten, as compared to this, would be a little darker in color. It wouldn't be near as fine as this. Actually, with gluten, what they do is first they soak the corn and they separate the different parts of that corn, the germ from the hull, from the rest of the corn, so it comes out a little more flaky as compared to this right here. And now this process here, which is our dry miller, the first thing they do is grind the whole grain, and then they soak it. So those products are totally different. Stepping back now to the gluten product, it's not near as high a protein. Distillers has about 28–30% protein. Gluten has about 18 to 20% protein. Second of all, fat. Fat on distillers, which we have here, has about 8 to 10% fat, whereas gluten has about 2 to 3% fat. Phosphorus is about the same in both those. So gluten comes from wet milling, comes from producing corn sweetener. Distillers, which we have here, is dry milling, and it comes from ethanol production.
Thank you, Dave, for clearing that up for us. Today we're standing in front of another feed source, that of hay. We saw how it was baled and processed. The machining was done. Can you enlighten us on what this is about here?
Yeah, this particular operation has a pretty good sized number of cows, and they're both spring and fall calving cows. And of course that round bale baler down there we saw, this is what really the bales look like once they come out of that. There's different sources of hay they use here. One, of course, is in the spring of the year there's probably a lot more pasture production than is needed, for just the cows on pasture. So they go out and they harvest this excess pasture production, in the spring of the year, and that would be part of this hay that they produced here. The second thing is they have a lot of grass waterways around. And of course they mow and harvest those grass waterways as a feed source. And then of course the last thing is just actually out of their hay fields that they make multiple cuttings out of. The important thing on these round bales is trying to reduce the spoilage or the loss. And of course one loss can be from the water from the top, and really by the net wrapping, and see it on the bales here. This is a net wrap I showed before, and it's wrapped probably about 2 or 3 times around it, and it's kind of a stretch type wrapping, and that really helps shed the water. The other thing is, of course, have it on some location where you don't get all that moisture coming up from the bottom. And I guess the thing I see quite often is people taking round bales, putting them on the north side of a tree line and having them shade it. And that's probably the absolute worst thing to do, because you got to keep the location real dry and everything. So what they'll do with this hay right here, of course, they'll either use their processor, which they have used. They also want to purchase actually a hay baler, or hay bale processor that will actually drop 2 of those bales in it. They, of course, will supplement that with the co-products that we have down here, meaning the distillers, and, of course, provide some minerals and vitamins, and that'll really provide just a great feed source for this winter. Again, in our feeding of cattle, we got to have, especially our cow herd, during the winter, meaning late December, January, February, even into March, we got to have some type of harvested feed, and that's what this is right here, is your source of harvested feed for the cow herd during the winter time. And again, you harvest it starting in the spring through the summer, and store it, and then of course feed it to them during the winter. This particular, you notice there's quite a bit of concrete here. This particular location was really a confinement feeding barn. They actually took the building off of it. They put some rock kind of where the pits were and everything, and it really has made a pretty nice dry location to store these round bales of hay.
And that was a cattle feeding floor?
That's right. There was actually 2 buildings here, and they finished cattle here, you know, on this particular location. It was a pole building with, you know, a roof. Actually, they had a feed trough down, it was really down the center, with an alley running down the center between the buildings. And of course, all that's been removed now. And what you do many times on an operation is try to utilize what you have available. And with this concrete floor and the rock they put in the pit and everything, filled it up, it really is an excellent place to store hay and reduce the spoilage.
I see they don't have the bales butted up against one another. Is there a reason for that?
I'm not sure. Actually, I prefer, ideally, now this is ideal, I like to see the bales face north and south. Now in this particular situation, the way the building is, they had to run east and west. I also like to see them butted up tight against one another. What that would do would reduce the exposure to rain and things. So really, you know, I guess I'd prefer to see them butted up tight.
I see. Okay, good. Dave, we see quite a stack of bunk feeders here. What is the purpose of those, and just how are they going to utilize those?
One thing the operation does here, they don't tend to bring their cows up and confine them in a barn or something during the winter. They tend to keep the cattle outside in a kind of a pasture setting. And for winter feeding, they will actually use these as their feed trough. And again, it's a portable kind of feed trough where they can move them from one year to the next. We talked about earlier, you know, their desire to get their feed mixer and their bale processor that can weigh and mix in their distillers with their hay and everything. And what to do with these feed troughs is they're actually going to set up pads out in the pasture. They'll have limestone or rock down. Some of them they'll have geotextile material that they'll put down first, and then the limestone or rock over the top. They'll line these up, and then they'll use these for winter feeding for their cow herd. And this particular operation, as you mentioned, some of them are spring calvers, and of course the level of nutrition for those spring calvers after they calve will be a lot higher, different types of ration than their fall calvers. We'll see those in a little bit with some of the young calves. So these will be put in, kind of butted up in a row, multiple locations to feed their cows, whether it's their spring calvers, their fall calvers, their heifers that they're developing in different locations. So this is kind of where they put the feed in order to, once it's been processed, weighed, the rations mixed up, out here to feed the cattle. Okay, the next thing we're going to be doing is actually moving to the pastures, and we're going to talk about the pastures as far as what is ideal in a pasture setting is to have some type of fencing system to subdivide that pasture. If we think about pasture, and we think going all the way back to the buffalo when they were here in Illinois, that actually buffalo were they tend to graze on the location, and then they'd move down maybe 10 or 15 miles to another location and graze, and then they'd move to another one, and they may move around 6 or 8 or 10 times before they come back to that initial location where we started about. And that's really the concept of management-intensive grazing, or even rotational grazing. That buffalo started that once we in the range. That's the way a lot of the range cattle did. Whenever we started to build fences, we started to confine animals, and actually we went then to continuous grazing. We put cattle in a pasture and let them graze forever. And that's really not desirable, because beef cattle and all grazing species, they're selective grazers. They'll eat what they want and kind of leave the rest of it. So what we're doing is moving back to what the buffalo taught us many years ago, to what we call rotational or management-intensive grazing. And with management-intensive grazing, we tend to divide that pasture up into maybe 6 or 8 different paddocks, maybe 10 or 12 different paddocks. So we, have the pasture, the cows maybe consume this paddock for, let's say, 3 days, and then we move them to the next paddock, and it may take 20 or 25 or 30 days for them to rotate around. Well, one of the downsides of that is you got to build a lot of fence. And of course, historically, we tend to have woven wire fence, or we have barbed wire fence. That's pretty expensive to build and everything. So in order to subdivide those pastures, we're using a lot of what we call high tensile, single, maybe double wired fence. And that means that we got to get electricity out to those locations. And one of the things that we can do is use, again, technology, and that would be a solar fence charger. And that's what we are seeing here, is a full solar fence charger that probably generates electricity for this particular line of fence, maybe 1 or 2 other lines of fence. And that way you don't have to worry about running electricity out there. You can build these single wired, double wired, high tensile fences, fairly quickly and fairly reasonable. So it's a way to really better manage the pastures that we have out there. And it's a resource that we want to make sure we get as much production out of that pasture as possible, and management-intensive grazing will really allow us to do that. And technology, as we see here, which was really developed in Australia, they of course been doing this a lot longer than we have, and we adapted that here to the Midwest and really throughout the United States.
Good. Okay. Well, let's take a look at some of the pastures and the water sources and in the corrals, and carry on there. Dave, you mentioned a while ago that they were going to set up those bunks on some type of a surface. Do you want to illustrate what their intent is here?
Yeah, I guess one thing, what we call feeding areas, can become pretty wet and cause some at least tears up kind of the pasture and things. And this particular feeding pad here is set up to, I think, be as environmentally friendly as beef cattle people are. And I really think cow-calf people, there's probably no part of agriculture that's more environmental friendly than they are, simply because you got all this grass out in the pasture. We're recycling these nutrients back out to the pasture here. And actually what this is a feeding area that they're going to put, it's 20 feet wide, 200 plus feet long. They'll put about 20 plus of those red feeders that we just saw recently on this. And of course they'll come down this lane during the winter, drive off, just put that finished, the ration, the complete ration out here for the cows. And hopefully that'll keep them out of the mud. It'll really allow a place that they won't tear up the pasture or anything like that during the winter feeding period. The other thing too is it's limestone, so really even if it does get a little messy, they can blade it off and put it in a manure spreader and spread it out here, and all it'll do is improve the pH of the pasture out here. So it's really a feeding area for this winter to keep those cows up and dry, and so they don't tear up the sod that we have out here.
Now, will there be a fence run along this roadway as well?
No, they'll just be feeders, just strung down the middle of that, and they'll be able to come from both sides then and eat on both sides of it. So I would think this particular, there'll probably be 200, 300 cows here, that'll be feeding in this particular location.
Very good. Dave, the pastures are broken up into how many acres generally in each one of these pastures, roughly?
Yeah, these have about 70 acres in it, and really the concept of management intensive grazing, I think the important thing is how many paddocks you have. And even if you have 20 acres, you might want to divide those up into 6 or 7 paddocks with maybe only 3 acres each. And of course, if you only had a few cows, that would be what you would do. Of course, here we got a lot more cows, so our paddocks are much larger. So again, what they do in management intensive grazing is to rotate through these different paddocks with hopefully 3 to 5 to 6 days, in a paddock, and then of course move them to the next paddock, and then of course rotate around every 25, 30, maybe 32 days or so. Pasture is an area that's really, it's most interesting when you start talking about pastures. And of course it used to be that we just had continuous grazing. We just kind of grazed what was out there, the natural forages that we had, out there. But now I would say grazing pastures is more of a science. First of all, you have to make sure that your fertility level is what it should be out there, because especially our more improved legumes and stuff like alfalfa and some of those require a much higher level of fertility than, let's say, traditional kind of bluegrass or that type of thing. And so fertility is number one. Make sure we got proper fertility out there. The second thing is to make sure that we're using the right kind of forages and the right combination of forages. And depending on where you are in Illinois, in the southern part of Illinois, it's much different environment down there, meaning it's much drier, it's much hotter. So the forages that you grow down there would be probably a lot different than the ones you would grow in the very northern part of Illinois. And again, thinking about southern Illinois, fescue is a predominant species of forage down there. But as you go north on our grasses, probably orchard grass and brome grass is a preferred species up in that area. But in most pastures, what is ideal is to have a combination of grasses and legumes. Grasses, of course, are like your bluegrass that you might have in your yard that you might mow. Fescue down south, orchard grass, brome grass, those are really our predominant what we call cool season grasses here in Illinois. Then legumes are those which of course provide really a higher level of protein. It really also provides nitrogen to our grasses, and those would be like alfalfa, many of your clovers. There can be red clover, white clover, there's lespedeza, there's numerous different types of forages. So what you really want is a combination of grass and forage, in your pasture. It's really the best nutrition for the animal. By having legumes, it really provides protein to your grass. Now the second thing is managing those pastures after you have them set up. And the last thing you want to do is just let the grass go to maturity. And I always use the concept of why we mow our grass in our yard. And the reason we do is to keep it vegetative. I think you can probably, look at your yard or even anybody else's yard, and they don't see bluegrass going to seed head to keep it mowed. And by doing that, it's much more nutritious, it's much more palatable, for the cows. So by going through and rotating through those pastures, those paddocks, about every 28 or 30 days, it's just like mowing hay. So that is where management comes in, that you have a system set up to rotate through those pastures. Pastures can be very productive. It can start really early in the spring, go through into the fall with proper management. So again, what we see out here, if you look across here, you can see that the pastures still have some forages there. It's got 6 or 8 inches of residue out there, but you don't see seed heads that's gone up. It's gone to maturity. These particular pastures here are used for grazing, but they're especially used for calving, in the spring of the year. If you notice on this grass, you see it looks kind of shiny. That particular grass is mostly a fescue out there, and you might say, well, what does fescue do? Well, it's good grass in the spring and the fall. It's not very good during the summer. But if you're going to use that pasture during the winter, whenever it's wet, there's probably nothing better than fescue to keep really some vegetation out there, to keep so it doesn't get torn up. So these here are used for grazing. For calving during the spring of year, as well as some during the summer for some grazing.
Now, do they clip these pastures?
Yes, they would. Right. They usually go in, maybe not every time they cycle through, but maybe every other time they would cycle through, they'd go in and clip them. And that's really important because, again, those animals are selective grazers. They're going to go eat what they want and not eat, what they want to leave. And of course, you may have some weeds grow up. You may have some of the grasses go to seed, to maturity. So by going out and mowing it, that really lets that plant be vegetative then and stays green.
Now, we saw barbed wire earlier. Can you kind of illustrate this wire? This is the electric fence, hot wire, so to speak.
That's right. These are the high tensile fences here. Actually, of course, these are electrified. There's two strands here. If you notice here down at the bottom that there's insulator around that post. Again, these wires, it's crimped together here. These wires, of course, are stretched tight and everything. They are electrified. This line right here is what carries electric over to the other side. And there's two different kinds of fence. One is a physical fence, meaning a physical barrier. And that's really what the barbed wire or the woven wire is. The animal physically can't go through that, or hopefully it doesn't try to go through it. The other type of fence is a psychological fence. I mean, when you just look at this, you say, well, there's not much fence there. But there is electric on this fence. And by that animal, it's experienced by going up and maybe touching that once or twice. It knows that if it tries to go through that fence, it's going to get a shock. Now, you might say, well, it's electric, but it's only short impedance. It's not continually on. It's just electrified, just maybe every second or so, every other second. So these are psychological barriers. Works really great, especially as we try to subdivide these pastures, because we can build a fence very rapidly. It's not as costly as the other type of fence, and again, it keeps the animals in the pasture where we want it.
The feeder, the creep feeder that is in front of us here. When do they start creep feeding these calves, and what's that feed stuff consist of? Okay,
again, they creep feed here in this particular operation. Usually a creep feed is feed to supplement the cow's milk. In this particular operation, they start at 2 months. The feed that they put out there is usually very high protein feed. It's very palatable kind of feed, and it's just to supplement that calf. Anymore, really, calves have the genetic ability to really put on some weight and gain real fast. It even has more genetic ability to gain than that cow does with just strictly supplying milk to that calf. If we look at the milk curve, it reaches its peak in about 6 weeks or so, and then after that it tends to drop off. So, of course, if pastures are short, by creep feeding, you can continue to have that calf come along and put on weight. The other thing important too is in this particular operation, they early wean, meaning 4 to 5 months of age. So by that calf being able to know what dry feed is, when it goes through the weaning process, it just handles that so much easier. It knows what dry feed is, it knows what a feed trough is, and it'll tend to just be weaned without basically any stress at all.
We see another, looks like a feeder there. Is that?
Yeah, that is a mineral feeder. There's numerous different kinds of mineral feeders. What you want to do is put mineral out here because the cows on pasture, as well as during the winter, need some additional sources of mineral. Especially in the spring of the year, we run into a grass tetany, which is a magnesium shortage, so we can put magnesium type mineral out here. During the summer, we want to put some salt and some other minerals out here. Nice part about that particular mineral feeder, many times the old mineral feeders used to kind of stand up, and the bulls would kind of use it as just a punching bag, meaning they'd roll it across the pasture. This is a very low profile feeder where they can't get it and move it around. The top of it has got a weather protector over it, so actually they can just go in with their head, raise that up, and go right to the mineral. So again, just another source of providing nutrients, for the animal.
We've talked about feed quite a little bit here this afternoon. Now let's talk about the water and the water source. We'll see the water source shortly, but can you kind of illustrate the feeder here, or the water here, and how it works, and that is weatherproof? Is that right?
That's right. It's a non-electrified water. It's a fully insulated water. It can be used during the winter and does not need any source of energy to it. This particular water, what the design is on it is down in the middle of it. It has about a foot round tube that goes down the ground, probably 6 feet or maybe 8 feet. And the water line comes into that, and by that utilizes, in fact, it's a tube down there that utilizes the heat from the earth to keep that pipe thawed out and everything. Also, too, by the animals drinking out of it, that water that's coming to it is a temperature of 4 feet or so, or 5 feet underground, so it's warm, and it prevents it from freezing as it comes into the water. Now, the water balls here is actually, they push it down and they have access to the water. Now, it serves as to prevent that water from freezing inside of there, that water ball. Now, what happens is, if you don't have a lot of cattle on the waters, you might have to come out here in the winter and maybe just take your fist and hit it. If it's even maybe a little more frozen, that just a little hot water poured over it, and that'll thaw that ball out. It won't stick, and of course they can use it. So really unique, because we're out here, there's no source of electricity here whatsoever, but yet we can keep cattle out here all winter because we have a source of water. The important thing too is having water so cattle can get access to water. And there's been a lot of research done in how far animals should walk in order to consume water. What is the maximum distance they should walk? And we know many times out in the western range, they may have to go 2 or 3 miles to get to a source of water. What happens in that situation? First of all, their grazing distribution won't be uniform. They will tend to graze the most closest to the water, and the further we get out, the less grazings. And what we want them to do is be able to utilize all this pasture out here. We know through research that 800 feet should probably be the maximum that an animal has to use in our, distance in order to get access to water. So that's why these waters aren't placed at the corner of the pasture. They're placed right in the center of this pasture, so we have a close proximity to the whole pasture to the water. The second thing is, whenever an animal has to walk, let's say 3 miles to water, it's burning up energy. And the reason we have animals is to utilize the forage, to put on gain, to produce milk for the calf and things. So really this allows less energy to be used on that. The other thing is, animals are herders. And in a group of cows, we'll have the lead cow. And when that lead cow, when they go out to pasture, and that lead cow says it's time to go back to the barn to get water, what happens? All of them go back. But with having water out into the pasture, they tend to go as individual, as 1 or 2 or small groups of cows to water, and that means that whenever those few that need water at that time, the rest of them are still grazing. So placement of water, distance to water, fresh water is critically important. Matter of fact, water is the most important nutrient we have, and one that I think we have. That's another reason in the Midwest, in Illinois, livestock production is, I think, really good because we have good access to water in most places as compared to places out west, New Mexico, Arizona, and those locations.
And you said this was the breeding and calving lots?
This is the calving lots, right. And they'll breed in here as well. One thing that they use here, they want to make as much genetic improvement on this operation as possible. So they use as much technology. We talked earlier this morning about the use of artificial insemination. They use the very best sires that can be used in the Angus breed. And then they use technology in order to make sure that they get as many of those cows bred AI as possible.
And how do they do that?
Okay. Let me get something over here. Just 1 second. I'm going to grab something here that some technologies they use here.
Okay, Dave, we're talking about new technology here on detecting heat when a cow cycles. Can you explain those for us?
Yeah, what I would say the more progressive cow-calf operation is doing is tending to use as much AI, artificial insemination, as possible. And AI, the semen for most of these bulls are out of AI studs. There's about 4 or 5 of those that supply probably 90% of all the semen in the United States. And they have purchased and then distributed the very elite sires in the breed. And these elite sires might be for growth, or they might be for carcass, or they might be efficiency, or whatever. So if you want to produce a superior product, you know, you want to get as many cows bred AI, artificial inseminate as possible. Now, of course, with AI, you have to identify when that cow should be bred. And historically, that's taken a lot of labor, meaning that you usually twice a day went out and observed your cows that's you're trying to get bred, just visually observed them, you know, and kind of wrote down which cows were showing signs of estrus, meaning they were being rode by other cows. What I have here is, so the visual is one way to do it. This here is actually a rump tag that you put on. And of course, this silver on here, as another cow rides it, it will tend to wear that off. And you know, it'll be a bright green then. And I pulled scratch a little off here with my thumb, but my fingernail. But what'll happen is that'll be, and then of course when you go out there, it's another technique to go out and assist you to notice which cows have these rump tags rubbed off and everything. Of course, probably the Cadillac of the system is what we call, and is, I hate to use a name, but it's really the only one that I know that uses this technology, is Heat Watch. Now, Heat Watch, what it is this is transponder right here, and that transponder, each of them have an individual number, an individual signal it sends off. You have then a cow, and it has an individual number. So what you do is record which one of these you're using with a particular cow. Now what you do is actually, there's a button on that right there, and when that cow is mounted, it pushes that button. And what's happening, every time that button is being pushed, it sends a signal to a transmitter, and that's a transmitter up there, and that transmitter relays it back to a computer somewhere. And that computer records every cow and every time that she was rode. And it will actually, you know, each day you can go in and it can print out and say a cow 4195, you know, was mounted starting at a certain time of the day or night, and she had 27 mounts, and they were so close together, and that what the computer program says, you need to breed that cow 12 hours from now, which might be that evening or maybe the next morning. And what you do with this is actually you put this in the in the pocket here. That actually comes around, and well, the pocket's in the center right here, and you Velcro it in. You will actually then glue it to the rump of that cow. This is even a tie that you would tie to around the tail or around the skin next to the tail, and that would be every cow. You got to put one of those on. And it tells you exactly when to breed that cow by the number of time that she has been rode. Now, of course, with technology, quite often it's not free. That little transponder in there costs $40 each. You hope not to lose any of those, but that can happen. And that's why you really, put it in this pocket here. But it really provides the very best means of knowing when to breed cows. What happens so often in visual evaluation, you might be out there and you see a cow and she might be rode twice, when you're observing her. And it might be a false heat where she really is not in heat. That might be the only 2 times that she was rode that whole day is when you were observing her. And you might mess around getting her in, you might try to AI, or you might be successful or not. And of course you lose time, you lose, labor, which is expense. You may even lose the cane of AI that you use, the semen you use. So this really replaces labor. It improves the accuracy of which cows they use. And what this particular operation here is trying to do is breed as many cows AI as possible to improve the genetics in the herd, not only for replacement heifers, but also for, you know, steers going into the feedlot. There is a segment of purebred breeding stock here. They want to move that along as rapidly as possible and hopefully use those genetics in the herd as well.
And as we spoke this morning, those weaknesses in genetic weaknesses, you try to fill those in with good strong genetics, all right?
That's right. We know, and the breeding of cattle is a very, very scientific process. As we mentioned earlier this morning, it used to be the eye of the master kind of told you what animals to select, what bulls to use. The Chicago International and different shows was kind of the place that they determined what genetics to use. That is kind of history now. We know through the breed associations, with their breeding performance program, with their sire analysis, with computer programs, we know the merits of every bull and what the good points are, what may be some of the bad points. And what you have to do is when you set up the matings is to complement those. You know, you may have a cow out there that might be one of your very best cows, but she might not have quite enough milk and she might really produce too heavy a calf, you know, at birth. So you want to mate her to a bull that complements those, that overcomes those particular traits. And that's really the science now of making sure that you make the right matings in livestock production.
And you're working with this producer right now to index those cows and bulls, right?
Right. We know when we look at number of traits, we look at about 15 or 17 traits on every cow in the herd, every purebred cow in the herd. We look at those equal number of traits on the sires that were selected. Really in the Angus breed, there's probably 2,000 sires we got access to. And from that, we have identified about 8 or 9 sires that we think really have the merit. Some of those may only be mated to a very few cows. Others might be mated more aggressively to additional cows because of their genetic merit.
Okay, well, why don't we move on? If we find a cow that's in the optimum to breed, we move her to a corral. So why don't we take a look and just see how that operates.